Hi, I'm Thomas Friang. I'm the CEO and founder of the Open Diplomacy Institute. Very happy to curate this program of Global Leadership Masterclasses 2022. This is the second of the series for this year, which is supported by the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as NG and Global Affairs Canada, which is a great pleasure to cooperate with as we today address another burning topic. Last week we talked about public health global policies ahead of the World Health Assembly that takes place since Sunday in Geneva. Today we connect the dots between public health issues and gender equality issues, as there are many intersections about those two topics, and to address this very important issue of closing the gender gap. I am very pleased to host today four very passionate advocate for gender equality. Our key speaker will be Hosna JALIL, who is the former Afghanistan's Deputy Minister for Women Affairs, and who also was in charge of the Ministry of Interior. And we will have a round of discussion with three of our guests. Jocelyne ADRIANT-MEBTOUL, who is the co-chair of the Committee for Foreign International Affairs of the French High Council for Equality, and also the president of the CLEF, which is the coordination of European feminist lobbies. We will have the chance to host Vannary KONG, who was the co-chair of the 2020 U7 Summit in Washington, D.C., where she was in charge of the gender equality issues. And we also have the chance to host Ambassador Nancy SMYTH, who is today the ambassador of Canada to Ireland, but she was previously to that the Director General for Social Development at Global Affairs Canada. We were expecting to host Nielsen PEREZ 2021 Parliamentarians for Peace and chair of the Human Rights Committee of the Parliament of Costa Rica, but she could not be with us today, unfortunately. I'll focus the first part of this conversation with you, Hosna, and we are very honored to have you before we get to the panel discussion with our other guests. And as I said, you were in charge of the Ministry of Women Affairs in Afghanistan. Obviously, in the minds of many people around us and in the audience, Afghanistan surprisingly doesn't sound like a very female-friendly country, and for many different reasons. And in leading this ministry and specifically the policy planning within this ministry, you told me you had to cope with many challenges to make sure this would make a change, and that the first challenge you had to deal with was to draw support and resources to the public policy you had to deal with in a time where you lacked legal basis and institutional support to sustain your efforts. And I was curious in asking you how you managed to deal with this very difficult challenge of policy planning in such circumstances.
Thank you so much, Tom, for having me among such a wonderful panelists to join the discussion together with them. I mean, when it comes to gender gap, when it comes to gender equality, I think Afghanistan might be one of the worst places, particularly now, to talk about. In Afghanistan, of course, I mean, the mandate of the Ministry of Women Affairs might have been one of the biggest and heaviest mandate, actually, in terms of the deliveries among all the members of the cabinet or ministries in the government structures in Afghanistan. But as you mentioned, it has been one of the most under-resourced ministries, but at the same time, we believe that it's under-resourced. So for 20 years, the ministry has been struggling to find its way to serve the women in Afghanistan, and at the same time to redirect other ministries actually to serve women and women equally, and women and men equally. But then there had been two reasons for that. I mean, that the struggles did not lead to the direction that I, as a woman, being the beneficiary of the services of that ministry, was not satisfied with. First, the women has been treated as victims of violence only. So the approach for the women was always to protect them, not to develop them so that they can contribute to the development of the country. So there has never been a development approach towards women in Afghanistan for 20 years. And they have always been treated as victims. I get it. I mean, after some periods of civil war, after, I would say, being in a conservative society, I understand that the women are the primary victims of violence, but that should not be the only line of effort that we adopt in order to serve women in Afghanistan. So that has been the approach both by the Afghan government. That has been the only priority the Afghan government has ever had when it comes to working for women. But at the same time, quite similar approach has been on the international community side. So wherever, even in the laws, when you read the law, the key word in the law is protection of women, not development of women. You can hardly find them in the Afghanistan's law words development. So that was the main issue that we had first, because our approach initially was the wrong approach. I can't say wrong approach, but I would say incomplete approach. It could have been completed much better. So the Afghan women being in 2020 and 2021, taking care of 1/3 of the civil administration in Afghanistan, it hasn't been easy for them to earn that. I mean, to contribute to that, because the government made the minimum, I would say, efforts actually to facilitate their entry maybe. So they had to work hard actually to compete with their male counterparts. They had to work hard to enter the workplace. They had to work extra hard actually to get the positions that they felt that they deserve it. And the second one, why the ministry has not been able actually to redirect the resources across the government, because the ministry was not taking care of all the, I would say, service delivery or ensuring the opportunities, equal opportunities or resources for the women. The ministry was setting the overall policy direction for that, for all the efforts across government and institutions. But the ministry itself needed the power legally in order to be able to push other ministries towards that direction, because all the ministries should move to the same direction. It shouldn't be Ministry of Women Affairs doing all these stuff. It should be a whole of government approach. But then what happened is, at the end, we figured out like, okay, we lack the legal framework actually to strengthen this ministry, because the ministry was kept, and I would say it was a political decision of post-2001. So I consider the, I would say the lack of power or the lack of resources to that ministry, the inflow of the resources to that ministry was political. I would consider that. So what happens is when we looked at the law, like, okay, we do need to look into the law. I mean, this is not sufficient for what we are trying to do. And what happened, we figured out that the law is limiting the ministry actually to engage with other institutions for harassment of women, to counter harassment of women in the workplace, or violence of family violence for women, or providing them legal support, and that's it. So there was also a legal foundation issues that we had to tackle. We fortunately have been able to change the regulation, the legal TOR for the ministry lately, but I think it was too late after 20 years. So I would say we never have been able to achieve the gender equality in Afghanistan in 20 years before the collapse. But I can definitely say that we had a very fast-paced progress with the support of the international community, but at the same time, the Afghan government itself, which I would say it was not as effective as it should have been, but there has been a very fast-paced progress. And I would give the credit to the Afghan women themselves mainly.
Thank you for your leadership and for the grant to your fellow Afghanistan women who made it possible with and around you, I would say, as you were at the head of this ministry. I remind to our audience that you can ask questions through the chat. Don't use the Q&A module. It's better to go through the chat, and I'll make sure we can take your questions along the course of this discussion, and especially when we get to the Q&A moment at the end of the panel. But in saying so, I'd like to ask another question to Hosna based on our leadership experience. When we prepared this discussion, you told me that one of the key objectives you had to reach was precisely to mainstream gender equality policies across the government, just like you said. and specifically to ensure that women would have an equal access to resources in all policy areas across the government. Was it something that you believe you achieved when you were at the head of the policy planning in the Ministry of Women Affairs before the collapse, as you mentioned, or is it something you struggled to get to the point of reach?
I think it was absolutely a goal which we dreamed of achieving it. That's why we laid out the policy foundation, but we could never achieve it. In terms of ensuring equal access, women's equal access to opportunities, resources, and services itself. Partially because of the conservative society we had, that was one of the barriers. The second barrier was, of course, because of the approach we had adopted. And the third barrier was the legal framework we had that had to be changed, that we changed it. And the fourth one was we didn't have the time actually to achieve it. Things collapsed. So normally when we lay out the policy foundation for something and we figure out like, hey, this is the direction we have been going towards for the last 20 years, that requires modification. I mean, there has been a lot of impact. I mean, the approach has left a lot of impact, positive impact, but we can improve it. And this is the new or the amended policy foundation that we would like to propose. And that's accepted, but it requires normally time so that we gradually work with other institutions to get the result. And that's normally a long-term effort that we had to make. But just before we had done so fast and so quickly, we had laid out all the foundations that we required. So all we needed was, we had the structures in place, we had the legal framework in place, the improved legal framework in place, and at the same time, we had the platforms actually, which could give a lot of importance to the women's issues and pushing at the minister's level, pushing the agenda of women's equality in every institution. And that was the High Women's Council, which was led by the president, and every single member of the cabinet was around that table, and they have been getting direct orders from the president on what should they do, and they had to report to that platform. But things collapsed, unfortunately, so quickly that that it remained a dream, and we have a huge, severe setback when it comes to what we had achieved. I again repeat myself, so fast and so. I can't say we had reached to our ideal goal, but we had a lot of progress, like literally a lot. We had gone forward, I mean, a long way with the progress in terms of gender issues.
I am sure that there will be many questions about the examples of achievements you had in the time period where you served as the Deputy Minister for Women Affairs and what you managed to implement there. And in hearing to you, I have to outline and shed light on what we expect from leaders, and this is why it's called a leadership masterclasses, because we're trying to draw the portrait of leaders. And you spoke about setting new foundations and structures and changing frameworks that would sustain the changes that you tried to and you managed to initiate, but had to face a collapse last year. It's important for those who hear us from the different parts of the world and want to learn about policy leadership, that this is what is at stake, which is to change what sustains once you're gone, even in times of crisis. Which leads me to the third question I had to ask you, Hosna, is that you told me that in the government you took part to, the Ministry of Women Affairs was also a good leadership position to act for other types of vulnerable populations. What I mean there is that you kind of served as a children ministry, as a LGBTQI+ ministry, because there were none, and you did so before the collapse in time, meaning before the Taliban took back the power in 2021. And I was curious on knowing how did you manage to ensure this would make a change for them without endangering them, because it was not part of the tenure you had and the policy mandate you had, and what type of results you did get along this road.
Well, when I was serving at the Ministry of Interior Affairs, I've been dealing with cases of violence and abuse with the LGBTQI community. So we do have in Afghanistan, we do have, I can't say what is the size because we have never been able actually to identify all the members of that community, but I can say we do have a community out there. And they have been vulnerable throughout the years, unfortunately. The reason is legally because the Afghan constitution identifies its citizens as women and men. And there's no place for third gender legally. And the second one is it's such a conservative family that anyone exposing themselves is a taboo, and at the same time, anyone can take the right actually to abuse them because they're different. So I've been dealing with that issue, and we didn't have any specific institution actually to take care of them, to serve them, to provide them the legal services or the psychological services, or literally they haven't been able to get their services because they have been discriminated because of their differences. And when I moved to Ministry of Women's Affairs, I was like, well, this is a place that I think we can expand the portfolio. So the reason that I went out to look at the laws, the legal TOR, terms of reference for that ministry, like what this ministry legally is allowed to do and legally is not allowed to do, was because I really wanted to add the LGBTQI as a beneficiary of that ministry's services, to put them in the, I would say the group of, among the group that the ministry should protect them without actually putting them in the basket of women's services. So we could create a different basket of services for them. And that's why we initiated the national gender policy, which we lacked for years. So for us, in order to be able to mainstream all the resources and at the same time, all the institutions give them a single direction of how they should be ensuring equal access to resources and opportunities for women, and at the same time, services for women, we needed to have that national gender policy. And we initiated that, we completed that. And the good thing about that policy was that we included third gender. We didn't add specifically the name for the LGBTQI first, because we didn't know how many different sexual orientations do we have in Afghanistan. The second one was because we wanted to leave it open for any non-women, non-men, I would say, sexual orientation to be included as equal citizens. So that's why we added third gender, and that can be anyone to be included in that. And we had special treatments at the same time identifying their vulnerabilities so that the legal judicial institutions, but at the same time, the service delivery and development institutions could take care of them equally as they take care of other citizens. But at the same time, I could also see visiting the prisons or visiting the, I would say, the women's shelters. I could see that the children themselves, I mean, the children for the women are illegally staying with their moms because they have no place to go. And the mothers are the primary, I would say, breadwinners for those kids. And they have ended up in the prison. And it has been so difficult for us actually to redirect our requests from Ministry of Interior Affairs to both Ministry of Women's Affairs, at the same time Ministry of Social Affairs, and Ministry of Social Affairs didn't have a comprehensive mandate actually to take care of kids or children in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan had more than 50% of its population as children. So for us, I mean, taking care of the two groups, women and children, which are not separable in Afghanistan, in a country like Afghanistan, the affairs, women's affairs and children's affairs is quite impossible actually to separate them. But at the same time, it just creates duplication of efforts and resources if we do that. But in the meantime, there was no institution actually specifically taking care of the children. So we thought, let's expand this mandate, and that not only helps us legally actually to strengthen this institution and give it the power and the voice that it requires, but also we are doing something that other institutions are not doing it, and it's the most relevant institution actually to add to their portfolio. So we added that, but in countries like Afghanistan, what I would like to highlight here is that if someone goes against the social norms, if someone goes against the, I would say, the ceilings that the country is putting on you, then, I mean, someone has to sign up for a big challenge. for a lot of hardships to go through, like tackling or even talking about the LGBTQI, or the third gender we called in Afghanistan. That's going to be a taboo. So what happens is that most of my colleagues, when I raise this issue, like, hey, let's have the national gender policy, and let's address the issue of the LGBTQI in Afghanistan. Every single advice I received from my colleagues was like, hey, you know what? Your predecessor did not even touch it because it can cost you politically. It can cost you your position. And what happens is that everyone would tell that she is a member of that community, and I'm like, okay, what's the problem? That's just my difference. I mean, I'm just being different, so what's the problem with it? And then they're like, you might be dismissed because the public would oppose you being in this institution or serving in a political position. So sometimes I think for serving the communities, someone really has to take all those risks, the cost that might be associated to it. So it has been a taboo, and the reason I think that many of my predecessors did not address that, and the ministry really has been one of the best places actually to address this challenge, was because they really didn't want it to sign up for that cost.
And signing up for a cause that was not necessarily in the tenure of your position precisely is also a good lesson of leadership to draw from what you said. I'm pleased to invite in the discussion our other guests to keep running this conversation and hear from the experience of Hosna JALIL. Calling back to the screen, Mrs. Jocelyne ADRIANT-MEBTOUL, who is the co-president of the Committee for International Affairs at the French High Council for Equality, and the president of the CLEF, who is headed in Brussels. Happy to also host Vannary KONG, who is very, I would say, committed to this fight, and a strong advocate for gender equality, especially when she co-chaired the Y7 summit in Washington, D.C. in 2020. Welcome, Vannary. Happy to see you again. And Nancy SMYTH, who is ambassador of Canada to Ireland today. And prior to that position, I'm mentioning this because it is very much related to feminist diplomacy. Nancy was the Director General for Social Development at Global Affairs Canada, which is the official name of the Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Welcome to the three of you. We miss my friend Nielsen PEREZ, who could not be with us tonight, to this morning, depending on where you stand across the world. We were just talking about mainstreaming gender equality policies as a tough challenge in all pieces of the world. Obviously, Hosna's experience in Afghanistan was probably harder than in any places across the globe, but this is a topic for all female leader or all women's rights advocate. And I'd like to hear first the voice of Vannary about the way that youth has approached this topic during the Y7 summit in Washington, D.C. 2020, as we just came out of the 2022 Y7 summit in Berlin. We see that gender equality is always a problem, or at least a topic of the agenda, even within the G7 countries. And it always is presented as a expectedly transversal, holistic, very wide-ranging issue. So I was curious on the recommendations that came out of the Y7 summit in 2020, in times where the US was led by, I would not say a feminist president, if I may.
So it's great to see you again, Thomas, and apologies for running a little bit late. Working remotely definitely has its challenges. But yeah, so for the Y7 summit in 2020, our policy tracks were education and jobs, global connectivity and trade, energy, peace and security, and we also had a COVID-19 track. As I was involved with the summit, I definitely encouraged all the delegates to look definitely look at gender equality, but also look at the transformation when it comes to women. So when it came to global connectivity and trade, how can we empower SMEs that are women-owned, that are minority-owned, so they can compete in the global markets? Because as we know, COVID-19 served in a lot of ways disrupting the local economies or the Great Reset. So we wanted to make sure that as young people, we were being innovative and making sure that we're thinking of out-of-the-box ways, whether it came to IP protection or whether it came to sharing government resources from the local levels all the way to the high level, and even making sure that there was a lot of collaborations between countries in the global South to make sure that every woman or every person that identifies as a woman has equal access to education, has equal access to finding jobs, has equal access to making sure that access to healthcare, or also if they had children, to make sure that there was the childcare aspect as well. And then, of course, with the pandemic, there was also I would also call it an exodus of leaving their previous role. So making sure that tech firms such as Google and Facebook are also providing job opportunities so they can lead more towards finding new careers or new passions as well. As also in regards to the Y7 Summit, we're also encouraging more of the youth leaders to collaborate with their counterparts, whether it's the BRICS Forum or whether it's APEC Voices of the Future or the United Nations major group of children and youth. We wanted to make sure that from a holistic view, we're not only just looking at women in general, but also looking at the different age ranges and making sure we're customizing the different resources that are needed depending on where they were in their education, where they were when they needed supplies, and then also when it came to the policy recommendations that women also have a seat in leadership positions, and then also creating that cultivation for mentorship opportunities and building as we climb. Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks, Vannary. It does remind me a lot of needed work at the Y7 summit that our delegate took part with very much enthusiasm in sustaining your efforts to advocate for gender equality. We just touched a point which is very critical in hearing you, Vannary and Hosna, is the importance of the institutional positioning of the leadership for policy towards gender equality within the government. And an additional question I wanted to add to my list is to Jocelyne. Jocelyne, I talked to everyone that you were part of this high-level council, National Council for Gender Equality in France, where you co-chair the International Affairs Committee. This council is posted at the Prime Minister's office, and the Minister for Women Affairs in the French government is directly linked to the Prime Minister. It has been the case over the past 4 or 5 years, and is now still the case. What change does it mean for the cause we are talking about to have such a political structure that is set up?
Thank you for inviting me to this exchange, and thank you to Hosna JALIL for his answer. So yes, we are the High Council is I think yes. There are some progress, but it's very, very slow. Anyway, we are on we have a feminist diplomacy. We are on the 3rd National Action Plan for the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda since 2010. Our country was part of the UN Security Council that unanimously adopted in 2000 the famous resolution 1325, precisely entitled Women, Peace and Security, and now, indeed, our third action plan covers the period 2021 to 2025 and was published during the Generation Equality Forum held in Paris last year in June, July 2021. I would like, if I can, explain what is this plan, because the High Council is one of the missions of the High Council for equality, gender equality, is to evaluate the French strategy about gender equality. And the third women's peace and security plan is based on 4 pillars. First pillar, prevention by raising awareness of issues related to the fight against gender violence, women's rights, and gender equality. The second pillar, protection of women and girls from gender-based and sexual violence and violent extremism in conflict and post-conflict situations, and the fight against impunity. Third pillar, participation of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts. And the fourth and last pillar, promotion of the agenda and the national action plan. Just one word about Afghanistan. Afghanistan is among the priority geographical areas selected by France for the implementation of the French plan. And I consider that it is humanly one of the very first priorities when we see today the Taliban government, which tries to erase women and girls from the public space with restrictions and prohibition for them to work and go to school, the obligation to wear the burqa and to move with the guardian. So it's very important for us and for us feminist activists. To return to feminist diplomacy and its action, the High Council for Equality, as I said, has a mission to evaluate France's global strategy in terms of gender equality and women's rights. Thus, we have begun the evaluation of France's international strategy, which began in 2018 and will be completed in 2022, this year. And we will publish a report before the end of this year. In concrete terms, we analyze the action implemented by the ministry in France and imposed abroad and what results from them. And we study the impact of measures taken by the government and their impact of women's rights. We interview diplomats and civil society, both French and international, and based on all of these elements, we measure the progress or lack of progress and propose avenues of improvement for the next strategy, which will cover the period to 2023 to 2027. Similarly, we will evaluate a national action plan for women, peace, and security, and this village. I think that this diligence through the evaluation of France's external action for gender equality is a good thing. Is one of the essential missions of the High Council for Equality, but I think it's a tool. It's a tool very important for the the exchange and the cooperation between government institutions and civil society and feminist organization.
Thank you so much, Jocelyne. And as you clearly outlined in answering my question about the position of this French high-level council on gender equality, is that it's not only meant to assess domestic policies. It has a very broad mandate that also encompasses our foreign policy, and it is in explaining how broad this mandate was. You clearly pointed out the next topic I wanted to discuss, which is specifically this notion of feminist diplomacy, and I'm turning therefore to Nancy Smith from Canadian ambassador to Ireland. When we hosted this summit last year, the Forum Generation Equality, your Prime Minister from Canada, Justin Trudeau, was one of the 60 leaders committed to these coalitions around generation equality. And I do remember very well your fellow ambassador Isabelle Hudon in France being one of the pioneer in France to help us understand what feminist diplomacy meant in times where this concept was not even existing in the French public debate. She defined it as addressing the 3 R issues: resources, rights, and representations. And she was also very talkative, and I know that's something you've been part of as the leader of the Director General for Social Development at Global Affairs Canada, to develop a policy to address what Jocelyne told us about, which is designing an agenda for women, peace, and security at the global stage. And as we today witness rape being used as a weapon of war in Ukraine war, we can ponder how effective such an agenda for women, peace, and security can be effective. And I would like you, Nancy, to explain us what is at stake in when we talk about feminist diplomacy, what type of results we can get in having leadership of countries like France, Canada, etc., being involved in dealing with crises like the Ukrainian war on such a field. And it has been also important in Afghanistan because those 2 countries were part of the coalition in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. So it's a very broad question, but it all turns around the same one issue, which is what is a true and powerful and impactful agenda for women, peace, and security policy.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas. Thanks very much for the invitation to be here. Thanks for the partnership with Canada on this series, the overall series. And I would say also thank you for the great learning and sharing opportunity. And if there's one thing I've learned working on gender equality, is that it's a lifelong learning undertaking. And I believe that Hosna has mentioned this as well, that we still keep learning and adapting and understanding the communities that we're working with. And so I've heard a lot of wisdom here already, and it's an honor to share this panel with all of you. And also to have the opportunity to talk a bit about Canada's experience. And so what I'll start off by saying, and I think again it relates to some of what we've heard here, is that there is a wonderful team of gender equality experts that sits in some of our foreign ministries or women's affairs ministries or whatever their names might be, high councils. And so I always start by Hosna said, thank you to the women of Afghanistan. So thank you to the women and all those who identify as women or LGBTQ or others in terms of the work that they do ferociously on the ground every day. And thank you to the gender equality experts who have guided a lot of the work that we've done in terms of the feminist foreign policy and the gender equality strategy that goes back now several decades, starting with our international development program, and that covered, as you said, and thank you for quoting former Ambassador Hudon, the what we've called sort of the 3 key areas of the policy around representation equal representation around human rights and around access to resources. And so I think the whole topic of mainstreaming is really interesting, because I think we would agree mainstreaming is really important. And then I think we would agree that focusing is also really important. And so that's why the opportunity to talk a bit more about the women, peace and security context is really important too, is really relevant. And I think the whole preventing and addressing conflict-related sexual violence has certainly been one that we have heard from partners that comes out as a real priority. And it's been outlined certainly in our National Action Plan, and my colleague Jocelyne has talked about the French National Action Plan, and I think you'll find in our National Action Plans on women, peace and security a number of the same themes that are there. And so in this context, we would recognize the many partnerships in this ambition, Thomas, other governments that have been active and in the forefront of some of this, including some of our Nordic partners, France and Ireland, certainly where I'm sitting right now, including in their UN Security Council role, but also Jocelyne mentioned civil society. And they're certainly a very big part of that ambition, in fact, often driving the ambition and often driving governments to think more deeply about what we're doing, as well as kind of the global and international partners. So what does this all mean? I think to your question, part of this means, and we've heard this already from others, that the impacts of poverty, of policies, programs, and indeed conflict are experienced differently by different groups, and that women and girls, members of the LGBTQI community, and others belonging to marginalized groups, disabled and others, they're disproportionately targeted with conflict-related sexual violence. You've mentioned in your question issues that there are increased vulnerabilities to during crises, trafficking, rape, child early forced marriage. You've mentioned Ukraine, and we've heard the testimony of Afghanistan, which we know we keep very much top of mind. But second, it's also about taking some of these stronger measures to keep people safe and help survivors in rebuilding their lives. And really looking across a range of measures is also part of the ambition, strengthening accountability. Jocelyne mentioned this as well, and compliance with international human rights and humanitarian law, social norms. We've heard about some of that already. Psychosocial supports, I think we've come to understand even more, are necessary, medical, legal supports for victims and survivors. And so it's about working on protection, but also prevention. And, you know, specifically around our women, peace and security agenda for Canada, which is a core element of the feminist foreign policy. We've used what's in that work, which goes across governments. It's about 6 or 7 different government departments that are involved in this plan. So it goes well beyond Global Affairs Canada. And it's included the appointment specifically of an ambassador for women, peace and security. And some of you may have met my colleague, Ambassador Jackie O'Neill, who's done a fantastic job as our first ambassador, specifically focused on women, peace and security. The ambition, and Vannary's spoken about this eloquently, is really about the participation equally in decision-making, prevention, resolution, peace building, and they bring different things to the table in that regard. Hosna, you said victims. We've heard too often as the language that's used, and I think we would all agree, victims is an important word, but as you have said, it's also about actors and leaders and decision makers within that space that we need to change the narrative on. And then research and data, which demonstrates that correlation. And I think I would just highlight that as something that we've, and I think we've heard about some of the challenges within Afghanistan or other contexts where that's really difficult to get a handle on, but that certainly has to be an ambition as part of a women, peace and security agenda and as a gender equality agenda, in order to be able to demonstrate what the realities are and therefore what the responses should be. Thank you for mentioning the Generation Equality Forum. Thank you to France for hosting that and for mentioning some of the pledges that Canada made in that context. And so we were very pleased to serve as a co-leader for the Action Coalition on Feminist Movements and Leadership, and as a catalytic member and signatory to the Women, Peace and Security and the Humanitarian Action Compact in that regard. and also to start a series of Women, Peace and Security Awards, which has encouraged some innovation in the research space that I've talked about, as well as a year-long advocacy campaign, Peace by Her, which recognizes and supports the work of women peace builders, again, which are kind of at the heart of all of that. So feminist diplomacy, to come back to that phrase, is really around all facets: language, negotiations, advocacy, informal discussions, programming, support, political leadership. And I might just mention, because I think it's important to also think about some of those partners that we have in Women, Peace and Security, sort of in the military space. And Canada has worked with other partners on the ELSI initiative, which has looked at increasing the participation of uniformed women in UN peace operations, and also Canada chairing the UN Peacebuilding Commission last year with the focusing on gender and the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So we've heard about gaps, and that's just where I'll end, Tom, on this one. But I think it is really, we are definitely not there. We're far from being there, and I think we know that also. And some of the gaps around the continued threats, harassment, attacks, reprisals against women peace builders, the slow progress we know that's there for meaningful participation, and the widespread use, as you have said, that we hear about in a harrowing way, that's ongoing in too many places across the world, of conflict-related sexual violence with impunity, and insufficient, and I think inflexible funding that we've heard about for local women's organizations to work on the ground, and human rights defenders. And so that's also been, I think, a part of where we've tried to show, to demonstrate some support, and that is with local women's organizations, again, in partnership with so many others. So I'll end there. Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And then hearing your response and Jocelyne's response, I actually heard almost half of the G7 countries talking about this. France, Canada, and the US are represented here, and they were pioneering the coalition to support Afghanistan transformation. And I'm turning this back to Hosna. I mean, the first beneficiary of feminist diplomacy of those G7 countries should have been your ministry in Afghanistan, definitely. And as Nancy said, Canada was pioneering and leading the coalition of the Generation Equality campaign to support international feminist movements. So this is probably what has been at some point in the development of the Women Affairs Ministry in Afghanistan, a key support to set up this department. I would like to know your assessment of the role of foreign aid in structuring the policy for women equality in your country, and how it was perceived by the Afghan population in seeing that it was probably a foreign support that would help you gain momentum in doing so, whether it facilitated the acceptance of this policy in the Afghan population, or whether it provoked some backlash.
Okay, so when it comes to the promotion of this policy by international community present in Afghanistan, I would say partially the ministry itself, as I mentioned earlier. It was a newly established institution. Afghanistan has never had in its history a Ministry of Women's Affairs. This was the first time Afghanistan had a ministry. So for example, Ministry of Finance, it has been in Afghanistan throughout previous regimes. So Ministry of Women's Affairs, apart from a few commissions in the past, there has not been a Ministry for Women's Affairs. So I would say it has been a newly established structures, which required a little bit more time actually to mature, at the same time to have the right capacity to accept the inflow of the support that it had from the international community. So partially the limited capacity the institution had was the reason why we had a lot of scattered and at the same time, I would say parallel efforts going on. But at the same time, partially because there has been a tendency or preference by the international community as well to work independently sometimes. So I cannot say that when it comes to the effectiveness, it has been definitely effective in Afghanistan, but it could be more effective if it had been channelized through the same institution. And as I mentioned, there had been two main reasons why we haven't been able to be the monopoly of channelizing the efforts and the support in that area. How it was perceived by the Afghan population, I think as far as it has been led by the Afghan women and the Afghan men in Afghanistan, it has been a very local approach and it was acceptable. So what happens with at the local level, I would say, because it has been led by civil society, for example, supported by international community, it has been led by communities, like different groups and communities, volunteer communities. I would say at the local level, it hasn't been as much, the pressure wasn't as much as it was at the government level, central government level. It was accepted. But at the central government level, no matter what, we still have the same conservative men who doesn't want to work around the same table with women. So at the government level, I was very happy. It was making me very happy to have that conditionality of the foreign support and foreign aid for the promotion of the feminism policy in Afghanistan. And that was forcing our male decision makers actually to accept that as a reality, or they're not going to get the support they need. But at the same time, it was disappointing to see that the amount of dedication, commitment, skill sets, knowledge, and productivity we have been bringing in our institutions, the women in Afghanistan overall has been bringing. That was not an incentive for them to accept it without the conditionality of the aid. So I could see a few men actually believing in that. And it has always been a conditionality for aid. But what made me, I knew that it's not sustainable. But what made me hopeful was that this new generation of women already being either on their way to get into these institutions, or they're already there and holding positions of decision-making or power. They're the ones who would hold the ground for the next generations to come. But there has been a sudden collapse and we had no role in that. And it has also been, I would say, a male decision, even when it comes to the collapse. But what I would like to say, and that has been something that I've always believed in, if we really want women not to be a beneficiary of peace, because there's no beneficiary of peace when it comes to women, they're always victims of peace, like it happened in Afghanistan. They really have to be actors in security as well. So when it comes to women, peace and security, for me, if women are not actors and decision makers in security, they can never, ever be peace builders or engaged in peace. They can always be victims of peace. And that has always happened in the history of Afghanistan throughout the year. We have always taken the pride of not engaging in armed violence and conflict in Afghanistan during civil war or even now. The Afghan woman has not been a party in war, a warring party in Afghanistan. But what does that bring for us? Like literally nothing. We have always remained victims. And the Republic was an opportunity for us to push more women in the security sector, in the defense sector, as actors, and that could give them more space actually to have a voice that really mattered for other men when it comes to the peace. But we just had a few peace negotiators and they have not been regarded. I mean, their voice didn't matter as much as it should, and there had been back channel deals among men. And what happened, we remained to be, again, victims of peace.
That is important what you said in talking about the role and the representation of women in international security. That is one of the key rules that I reminded earlier on, and that Nancy explained, the 3 R's, the very very needed key components of feminist diplomacy: resources, rights, and representations. And in saying so, I'm happy to say that the Canadian ambassador who talked about this to us last year has now been the president and CEO of the Bank of Canada for Development, Isabelle Hudon, and Canada is still very active on this side. She indeed also pioneering, as I said, about this Women, Peace and Security tool that has been set up at the Generation Equality Campaign and Forum last year, co-chaired by France and Mexico. When we got to that summit in July last year, we obviously reminded us that 26 years before this took place the Beijing Conference for Women's Rights, where there was this famous phrase by Hillary Clinton that women's rights are human rights and it should be so once and for all. And it's not the case. Security, as we just talked about, is the first layer of equality for women. It should permit to add a second layer of equality, which is the economic autonomy, which is another step of emancipation for women. But the pandemic that is still raging affects more women than men. And it is the last topic I wanted to discuss with the three of you. Vannary, when you co-chaired the Y7 in 2020, we're in the very midst of this pandemic, and the Y7 summit had to take place for the first time in a fully hybrid format. At that moment of time and crisis of the international community, the US G7 presidency did not even take the time to set up, to convene a G7 meeting. And I wanted you to please help us assess how this problem of unequal impact of the pandemic for women and men was perceived by the American authorities at that period of time when you had to convey the Y7 messages to the White House.
So in regards to conveying the message, I think that when it comes to decision makers, you have those that focus on their work, and you have those that are more open to hearing youth propose strategies and solutions to issues. And so when we made the decision to make the summit virtual, we wanted to make sure that we were providing opportunities to the next generation of policymakers and leaders of the G7 countries to take not only to take a chance at solving these issues, but to also make sure that they're having the same opportunities that we've had when we had it in person previously. And I also think it was also important that we took the unprecedented step to try to make it in a digital space. And so some of the issues that we definitely wanted to cover in excess was in regards to economic justice, ecological and human rights, because also at the time too, when the virtual summit was occurring, you also had a lot of racial inequalities that were occurring in the US that were also inspiring other movements across the globe. So at the time, George Floyd did die. So when we're talking about a feminist diplomacy, we also must look at the role that race plays. And you actually see that very recently when it comes to Ukraine, because now through social media forums, whether it's TikTok or Instagram, you're starting to see a lot of women of other minority groups being denied human rights and aid just for the color of their skin, or they might have disabilities, or they might be of a certain age or of a certain nationality. So when you quoted Hillary Clinton, we must look at women as a holistic approach and not just look at the divisions between groups. And I think that's something else that I also wanted to bring into the Y7 summit, because at the time, a lot of times, especially in the US, when it comes to young people, those that focus more on the domestic policy and those that focus more on the foreign policy don't see the synergies behind both of those. And one thing that that me and a couple fellow leaders also tried to do when it comes to working to our counterparts, and specifically me now that I work in the Senate, is that there are a lot of synergies between the local and the globals. And so we must also work together because there's a lot of power in numbers. So making sure not only when the COVID statement was released, but when it came to advocating for rights of minorities, that's also being brought into the conversation, especially if we're promoting the UN SDG agenda as well.
Thanks, Vannary, and indeed in reminding us the events that took place at that very time in the US, you outline how important for some countries having an intersectional approach to feminist agenda was key there, and it's part of the tools. The intersectional approach is part of the tools that was used to design a gender-specific response to the crisis, and making sure that handling the pandemic, especially its social and economic consequences, was as equal for men as it was for women as it was for men. And therefore, I would like to turn to Jocelyne, because at that time of your leadership positions, you were already president of the CLEF, which is the coordination of lots of feminist associations in France, and part of this High Council for Equality. And you clearly have been advocating for a feminist recovery plan. Did this happen in France or in any other country? And how would you assess our own ability to respond to such a crisis with a gender-specific approach?
Yes, I believe that France's responses to the pandemic were not gender-specific at the beginning, and maybe in the world, neither. It was a question of responding urgently to the emergency, notably by injecting significant funding into all the sectors that were suffering in particular. But soon enough, we realized the devastating impact of the pandemic on women first and foremost. An exponential increase in domestic violences, women on the front line in healthcare, 90% of healthcare workers in France, in food, supermarket cashiers, less access to sexual and reproductive healthcare and to women's health, etc. I believe that in France, I believe that the gender-specific responses have not always been up to the challenge. For example, with regard to home-based carers and care assistants whose precariousness has not been sufficiently taken into account, even so they were on the front line in the face of a still very deadly virus. But it seems to me that there was a real awareness that it was imperative to put in place gender-specific responses to the many inequalities in the consequences of the pandemic. This is how the 39 and 19 number, an emergency telephone number for victims of domestic violence, became open 7 days a week and 24 hours a day. And on this chapter of violence, the nomination of Isabelle Rome as Minister of Equality between Women and Men, that is to say, the magistrate in charge of the follow-up of the Grenelle of violence, seems a strong symbol, as the nomination of our Prime Minister, Elizabeth Borne. I think it's, and I don't know if she's a feminist woman, but I'm sure she believes in social justice, and the inequality between women and men is a problem of social justice. I want to believe that it is a way for the government to show that it is aware of the necessity to establish gender-specific answers, especially in situations of multiple crises as we are living today. Anyway, us, feminist organization, we will be always vigilant to to see if we progress in taking into account sexo-specific situation in France and in the world, but in France for our government.
And that's another important aspects of taking lessons, drawing lessons of leadership by this conversation, is that a good leader is courageous enough to be able to suffer the assessment of such a vigilant high-level council as you're part of. And that the fact that you just mentioned that France as now a French female prime minister is a good way forward to move to Nancy. You pondered whether she was a feminist, whether Elisabeth Borne was a feminist. I can witness that she was, and she is, because she was part of the 16 ministers we hosted last year during the Grand Tour, previously taking place beforehand of the Generation Equality Forum, and she definitely was a strong advocate for gender equality, and she was also a strong advocate of the SDGs. And I'm picking this up as Vannary recalled the importance of this UN tool to mainstream women's rights agenda. But I wanted to pick up the fact that Elisabeth Borne was appointed prime minister in France, and she's thus the only second female prime minister we have along the Fifth Republic, in saying that in Canada during the pandemic, the vice prime minister was a lady too, and she was beforehand the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of the Minister for Foreign Affairs. I'm talking obviously about Chrystia Freeland, and Chrystia Freeland was precisely in charge of budgeting and taking care of the budget in Canada during the pandemic, and that's why I was turning to Nancy in asking how Canada did manage this necessity of having gender-specific policy responses to the crisis, and how it has also shaped probably your foreign policy, probably like just in France, for example, making sure that international aid and foreign support was taking into account feminist criteria. Did it change in Canada at that period of time with Chrystia Freeland leading the budget for the government?
Thanks very much, Thomas. I think it's a really good question that you've asked about how Canada handled domestically the pandemic and what kind of impact that would have had internationally. And I want to pick up on something that Vannary said, which is about sort of this domestic and international lens. And I think, you know, for a lot of countries, work that we do internationally that sets, you know, a certain vision and certain values. There's also, I think, been continually a recognition around work that needs to happen, you know, in Canada as well. And I think the fact that in no country, and we've heard Jocelyne say the same thing, in no country would we say we've achieved gender equality. And so the work is there to do, and it needs to be done at home, and it needs to be done internationally. And certainly we've been very fortunate with feminist leadership, including in the finance department, through the COVID pandemic. And so I think also what increasingly, and I think Jocelyne's right, this kind of sort of built over time, this increasing understanding around how the inequalities were going to be felt differently by women and girls from the pandemic and the crisis, and that would be disproportionately felt, you know, by women and girls, and that would relate to not only job losses, reduced work hours, but also shouldering, as others have said, the majority of unpaid care responsibilities. And so this kind of overrepresentation, which we would see in Canada as well, of women in a lot of those essential and service industries that we know were so impacted, accommodation, food services, educational services, the care economy. We saw in Canada the lost jobs when we look back at March 2020, and I'll come back to the issue of data. We're almost at twice the rate for women than men. And also that men gained back jobs more quickly than women had. And so we also looked at the women's ability to participate in the labor force and continue on with their own education, understanding that disproportionate impact. So what I would say, we had some head start on this because the government introduced in 2017 a gender-based budgeting process. And that was a requirement for all budget decisions to be informed by a gender-based analysis. And when the COVID crisis came, that analysis did help to sort of address and inform some decisions on investments. And concretely, maybe I'll just list a few of them, as you've heard in the other context, as in France. This was, first of all, kind of acknowledging and being able to demonstrate and also resourcing what we kind of came to call the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence that happened, and I think that was seen in all of our countries across the pandemic. And so for this, there was a new national action plan to end gender-based violence that was developed. We also had a new program called the Feminist Response and Recovery Program that was put into place through our Department for Women and Gender Equality, providing some support for projects helping those in greatest need during the pandemic. And this included, and I think this goes back to Hosna's comments around women and being very broad and intersectional in terms of how this is being defined. Indigenous women, Black women, women of color, women who are members of LGBTQ communities, who identify as women, women living with disabilities. And I think others have also spoken about the rural and remote context. And so this has been seen as really an important way to both support a more inclusive recovery for women and girls, but also supporting leadership and decision-making roles and improving economic security and addressing this stubborn issue of gender-based violence. Also an action plan around women in the economy, and you asked about sort of economic impacts as well, and ensuring that there was a feminist response to some of this. And again, more work that needs to happen in that area, but specific measures made to address that. And then finally, we talked about care and the care economy. And I think the Canada-wide early learning and childcare system, that's been a real priority of the Prime Minister and the government, working across all the provinces to put that into place, and to ensure that there's a recognition of those who are not able to work the same number of hours, and to put a specific focus around childcare and around early learning has been really important. Globally, and I'll try to be brief here, but to say that we have seen some of these same kinds of, obviously, in a more, I would say, obviously in a more concentrated way with partner countries. And so certainly a specific focus around gendered impacts of the pandemic has also been part of the work through Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy, specifically focusing on, again, SGBV, or we talked about sexual gender-based violence. You asked about kind of the links going back to your public health in your first series, and obviously very much we would see a number of essential services that would have been impacted, and a need for specific focus on those, but also in the education space as well, including for those left behind. And so the whole space of economic diplomacy, you've talked about the security layer and then the economic layer. So I'll come back to our wise, useful youth voice and say, it is about the holistic approach. It's not about one layer and then the other layer. It is about that full package of the SDG, including the economic space. And so that would include support for women's economic empowerment, but also thinking about that from a trade perspective and a progressive trade agenda, and thinking also about whether or not the trade that we're conducting and trying to, mainstream that thinking around ensuring that benefits are equal to all, from trade is also specifically targeting areas such as women-led businesses, indigenous-led businesses, entrepreneurship, access to credit, and to areas such as free trade agreements themselves that now have gender chapters, including the first one that we did with Chile, and more recently an initiative with Mexico, New Zealand, and Chile around Inclusive Trade Action Group that's looking at how to again accentuate even more some of the gender work. So the gender equality of forum, we'll come back to that, just to say that there was also specific announcements there around unpaid and paid care work in low and middle income countries, which Canada has committed to supporting. And that's I think really a really kind of new pioneering area in terms of recognizing that. And certainly for those of us who have traveled and worked in many countries, we have heard that a lot, that's something that women and women's organizations have asked for support in this area. Finally, data, research, communications, advocacy, are all key in this, and including, and maybe we'll say especially youth advocacy, so that we know that we're tracking those differentiated impacts. We know how women are doing in the economy. We know how they're doing in the labor force. We understand that they can access benefits, and that they understand they can access benefits and programs, and then that we continue to, move the goalposts and continue with the vision, so that we are continuing to kind of learn and adapt. It's not stagnant. And I think certainly the pandemic did not allow us to be stagnant, and really needed us to kind of think outside of the box again, to quote one of my fellow panelists, and think about how we were going to start to insert particular attention to gender equality in that work. So thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. I have to highlight something very important you said, that Canada introduced gender budgeting very early ahead of the pandemic, which is a strong difference that makes it to France, for example, which started to experiment gender budgeting just the year before the COVID pandemic, and it makes a big difference in having a gender-specific economic recovery plan to face the pandemic. And we are still in this stage of experimentation, and Jocelyne and I, who are strong advocate for feminist policies, keep saying that we need to change our budget law to make sure that this is not only an experimentation, but it starts to be within the structure of the policymaking process, which brings me back to one of the points that Hosna made earlier on, which is changing the structures. And at that stage of the conversation, I'm taking questions from the audience who were talking of different topics on the chat, and one of the probably most important question is to you, Hosna. People were curious on knowing how mature your agenda for women affairs came to be before the collapse. What level of assessment and of satisfaction you would state in the reach you got at before the collapse, and to also assess the consequences on the fallback of the collapse, how deep it was, and how it has changed the landscape for women in Afghanistan. That's a question that we have to cope with, because all across our nations here at the table, we had these images of very courageous women, Afghan women, striking in the streets in Kabul to keep advocating for women equality at the stake of their lives, and that's also a lesson of leadership from the streets, and brings us back to the difference it made between your time and the time of the collapse. Could you help us to assess this change?
Thank you for the question. How mature was the, I would say, the gender equality agenda in Afghanistan? I would say At that point in time, we considered that mature enough because we had added the experience of the last 20 years. And at the same time, we had identified all the gaps that we at that point in time have been able to identify them. And we had identified the areas for improvement. And we added them to the agenda. At that point in time, I can say it was mature enough to move forward, but there's nothing as perfectly mature when it comes to the policies and when it comes to the particularly when it comes to the gender equality in countries like Afghanistan. So at that point in time, I would consider that mature enough, but it needed more time actually, so that we could practice it, we could take it into action, and then we could come up with the gaps, we could identify the gaps. Unless we take them into the action, I mean, we implement it, we cannot identify more gaps in it, more flaws in it, so that we could address that. So at that point in time, again, I'm repeating myself, we considered that mature enough, but the consequences or the severe setbacks we had with the collapse or the Taliban's takeover, I mean, that was what I believed in and what I expressed myself the day after collapse. And I still believe in it, is that we got back to pre-2001, unfortunately. So the same old Taliban, the same old policies, and when it comes to women, and the same old treatment, but it has gotten worse actually. The reason is because the Afghan women, they have been pretty active in all different layers of the Afghanistan's development, and they have been actively participating in security and defense as well. So Taliban, I guess, has got, I believe actually, they have grievances and they're after revenge. And that revenge is both for women and men. So I would say it has gotten worse than what it was in pre-2001, and they are implementing their policies pretty, I mean, I was expecting it pretty fast, but it has happened because of what they demand from the international community, the financial support and the recognition. It has been, even though it's considered to be fast, but I was expecting much more fast if I knew Taliban. And they're the same old Taliban, and even more brutal and more experienced when it comes to war and violence. So the consequences is that they have got back, and I'm quoting an ex-colleague of mine in ANDSF who has been on the streets the first days after the government's collapse. I was speaking to her and she was getting prepared to go on the street and protest. And my question was, do you know what you're signing up for in terms of the risk? Because she was a single mom and she was the breadwinner for her kids. Do you know what you're signing up for? And she's like, yeah, I know that's going to cost my life, but there's no life. So yeah, the consequences, we have severe setbacks. We have gone even worse than what it was in like early 2001 before the establishment of the new regime. But what makes me happy is that the women in Afghanistan, they're very resilient now. I mean, my mom is the generation who served Afghanistan during the Taliban regime. She keeps telling me, like, this generation, they're not going to step back easily. But if this goes on for a while, I'm afraid of having this generation die down, and the next generation, they're not going to be the same.
That is a very powerful testimony of yours. Thank you so much, Hosna, for bringing us back to the reality of what happens on the ground in Afghanistan these days. I'd like to ask you a round question to all the four of you. The same question. I'm the only man around the table, and I keep saying, and I'm sure you will fully agree with this, that men have a role to play in making sure that feminism is not only an issue of women, obviously, and therefore I'd like not only to ask you whether you do believe so, but if you could give an advice to men for being as effective as possible to sustain feminism and women's rights and women's emancipation and women's economic autonomy and security, what would be the one sentence advice you would give to such a young man just like I am? I would like to ask this question to Jocelyne first, then to Nancy, then to Vannary, and then obviously to Hosna to wrap up.
Oh yes, feminism is a question for women and men. Because feminism is not a new system of domination of women, but just a society, equal society. I think I'm sorry because I'm not very fluent in English, as you know, but I think we work, we feminists and we women, and you, Thomas, and some other men, heureusement, we work for all the society, not for one category. It's only because we are we including diversity of education, of construction, of difference, that we will have a common benefit for men and women.
Thanks, Jocelyne. And that echoes what Hosna said, that developing women is developing the nation as a whole, in a sentence, I would say. Nancy, what would be your advice to a teenager, a male teenager that needs to be taught about feminism? What would be your advice to him?
Well, I'll start by saying thank you, Thomas, for being around the table, and all are welcome. You know, we talk about women representing 50% of the population. So, you know, there's another 50% to that. I would say, and you use the word effective, you know, so about being effective. And so I think advancing gender equality and advancing sort of diversity is about, you know, first becoming informed and understanding lived realities and understanding what the evidence demonstrates. And then I'll quote something that, you know, our Prime Minister and many of our political leaders would say, and that is, you know, it's the right thing to do and it's the smart thing to do. So inform yourself, and then it's the right thing to do and it's the smart thing to do. And we welcome all feminists, men and women.
We all remember Justin Trudeau responding to a question when he was appointed Prime Minister, how beautiful it was to have a gender equal cabinet, and it was, well, we are in the 21st century, isn't it normal? It was so fun to see him responding so boldly and simply to that bizarre question. But what you said, being effective and getting results, is probably the fourth R we should have to resources, rights, and representation. Vannary, what would be your advice to a young leader of yours, of your generation, to be an effective advocate for gender equality in the US, for example?
Yes, absolutely. And Thomas, I do want to thank you for allowing me to be on this call with all these inspiring women. I'm just learning so much on this call. But I would like to start off with a quote with one of my really close mentors, U.S. Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley, who's now the Chief and Diversity Officer at the State Department. On our first call, she always told me that change doesn't happen with one person, it happens in waves. And so what that means is that everyone has a place, whether it's advocating for feminist diplomacy, racial equality, whatever the cause is, everyone has a role. And some of my biggest advocates in the workplace, whether I was working in the private sector or now working in the government, is a lot of men have actually played a huge role, whether it's getting a promotion or being able to sit at the table and writing bills and legislation to pass through Congress. And I feel that feminism can sometimes have a negative connotation with the views of hating men. And it's not that. We're all working together to dismantle inequality so women can have a seat at the table, so women can play a large role in security issues, whether it's in the digital space or on the ground in military work, and also just even providing educational opportunities. So my advice would be to connect, to work with people because you never know, you can make the next big project that can influence and touch so many lives. So don't be afraid to reach out, network, and meet great people, whether it's locally in your own country or in your own neighborhoods and communities, or even just in countries that traditionally didn't have diplomatic ties.
Thanks, Vannary. And it does remind me the fact that for the last few years, Y7 and Y20 summits have now been co-chaired by women and men equally, and that makes a lot of difference in providing more meaningful recommendations to G20 and G7 leaders. Hosna, you were our key guests, and I'd like to thank the three ladies who spoke before you, Jocelyne, Nancy, and Vannary, for taking the time to speak to us tonight. But you are the last one to give an advice to a young man who would be willing to be a feminist but doesn't know how to take it and make it happen.
I think it's the most beautiful thing actually to have a discussion on gender equality, on women's equal right to compared to their male counterparts in a group of women and men. It's not, I mean, I never enjoy talking about always about women's right in a group of all women. So, I mean, what I would, if I would happen to be in a group of young teenagers, male teenagers, or young men, I have a couple of questions to them, and I would like to, as Vannary mentioned about the negative connotation of feminism in many societies. Any man who believes in equality, that can be gender equality, that can be equality about, among majority minority social groups, that can be equality about anything. Any man who believes in equality, they're feminist by default. Any man, they don't have to express themselves. Any man who believes in just society, they're feminist by default. Any man who has the moral values, they're feminist by default. They don't have to express themselves. So the other thing that I would like to tell them is just having a question: can they really imagine in an all-men world, living in an all-men world? I mean, I'm sure the response is no. Then if that's no, then why don't they recognize the efforts the women are making? Most of the times the women are making either equal or more efforts than their male counterparts, but that's too informal, and just because it's a male-dominated world, it's just not recognized. Then why don't they be humble enough, actually? And humbleness comes with like great personalities. So why can't they be humble enough to recognize the efforts they make? As a mother, as a sister, as a wife, as a, I would say, daughter, but at the same time, as contributors to the development of the world, as peacekeepers mainly, and as advocates for peace all across the world. And at the end, it's men who normally, in my part of the world, who wages war, and it's women who promotes peace. So why can't they recognize the fact that we are the ones, particularly in Afghanistan, who cleans up the messes they leave behind? And literally, they cannot live in an all-men dominated, in an all-men world without women. It's just a natural, I would say, combination, and no one can go against it. So for me, I mean, my advice to any young men, I mean, young teenager or young man, is that they shouldn't be ashamed of calling themselves a feminist. That's I would say, the best thing actually to call themselves, because they believe in justice and equality, and that makes them the best versions of human beings.
Thank you so much, Hosna. What you said reminds me that today is, since the Generation Equality Forum, I had a daughter, and I promised myself to keep talking her feminist stories every night, and she's 9 months old today, and on top of astronauts or pilot stories that I can talk her beyond princess stories, I'll probably have a blue helmet story to indeed make sure she believes that women are very effective peacemaker, as you just said, Hosna. And I'm sure that when she learns English, I'll probably show her today's masterclass so that she can witness how effective female leadership can be in hearing the four of you. I'd like to thank you very much indeed for being with us. Thank you, Jocelyne. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Vannary, and thank you, Hosna, from anywhere in the world where you stand. Thanks to our audience for having asked those questions. We had many other questions we could not cover tonight. I'll wrap up in saying you goodbye and announcing the next Global Leadership Masterclass we have on the 31st of May, which is going to help us discussing infrastructure geopolitics with Dr. Mihai Prekop, who is the Secretary for Finance in Romania. We'll see you next week, same hours, same place, on Zoom to keep discussing what leadership means to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. See you next week.